Greetings, one and all, and welcome to Horizon, the official podcast from the United Nations Association for Climate and Oceans. My name is Oliver Norris, and I'll be your host as each episode we explore issues that really matter to our world today. This is our first episode, and as such, I would like to hand over briefly to the chairman of the United Nations Association Climate and Oceans, Gonzalo, who'd like to say a few words of introduction.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and it's great to be here launching this new podcast for the United Nations Association Climate and Oceans Horizon. Thank you, Oliver, for being the host today for the series. And this is a podcast where climate, oceans, and geopolitics collide. In each episode, Oliver and guests will explore the forces reshaping our planet: rising seas, shifting currents, energy transitions, environmental tipping points, and the global power struggles intertwined with them. From coastal communities to international climate negotiations, Oliver and guests will unpack how environmental change is transforming economies, security, and the balance of power. Because the future of our planet isn't just environmental, it's political, strategic, and deeply human. So this is Horizon. Let's look beyond the surface. Over to you, Oliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. So today, for the first episode, our guest is Lauren Banham. She's a special advisor to the CEO of Stop Ecocide International and has spent over 6 years working at the intersection of law, climate, and the UN systems. Stop Ecocide International advises governments in embedding climate justice into policy and is actively involved in the efforts to criminalise severe environmental destruction in the form of ecocide, the subject of which today's podcast is going to be primarily about. So, Lauren, can you sort of start us off? How did you end up working in the space that you do now?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me as your inaugural guest. It's a privilege to be here. It all started with UN 75, actually. So in January 2020, I was invited to speak on the future of the United Nations at an event that was happening in my local town. And when I went to this event, I met people who had organised the event, who worked for an organisation called Peace Child International. And then we might all remember that a few months after January 2020, a rather large world event occurred, and suddenly everything was online, which provided a fantastic opportunity to be engaged in lots of different events that were happening in the lead up to UN 75. So it started off like this. I worked with Peace Child International for a number of years, which gave me a background working with the UN on a number of different issues.
Amazing. You mentioned sort of when we were first discussing this podcast that you spent a lot of time working around participation in the UN systems. Why do you think that increasing participation in the work that you did was really important?
So when I started and I was working with Peace Child International, one of the things I actually said in the initial event that I attended, which kind of alerted them to the fact that I might be interested in working with them going forward, was I talked about how given all of the digital and mobile technologies that we have now, we have the ability to engage different people in UN systems that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be involved. And the reason I said this was because the UN, to me, at that time, I was 17, felt incredibly far removed. It felt as if myself and my peers didn't really know what was going on. And I knew that the decisions that were being made were impacting me. And beyond this, I knew that there are people all around the world who would probably have fantastic ideas to contribute and who were absolutely impacted by the issues that were being discussed. And so when I went further into this issue, I realized that both expertise comes in the form of technical understandings, but also in the form of lived realities. And so I felt like it was really important that when issues are being discussed at the UN, they're not being discussed just by people who perhaps have a technical understanding or an academic background in the matter, but also they're being discussed by people who have an actual understanding of what it is to live these issues and what it is for their lives to be shaped by the decisions that are being made.
That's fascinating. And then, so from that initial sort of introduction to the UN and that. What sort of pulled you through from that and brought you sort of into the sort of space you're in now, where you're working with the climate justice and the international law sort of intersect?
So it's actually quite funny because when I started my degree, I said to Peace Child that I want to take a bit of a step back and I'd like to focus more on my degree and my education. And so they asked me, would the final thing that you'll do be go to this conference for us in New York, that was in preparation for the UN Summit of the Future? And I said, well, okay, if I have to. I was like, this sounds like a great opportunity and I would be absolutely honored to go. So I said, yeah, I'll go. And while I was there, I met two people and we began to talk about what was missing from conversations, because I was experiencing my own frustrations that while the conversations that were happening were very important, there was a definite lack of enforceability, and a lot of resources were being used to have discussions within civil society about what it is we could put together, and then that could potentially have an impact on UN negotiation, which then could potentially have an impact on day-to-day lives of people. But I think I felt that there was a definite lack of discussion about how these changes would actually be enforced. And so that's when I started to look towards international law. And this was particularly relevant to me in the climate justice sector, I felt, as I thought that there was a real lack of conversations about how can we actually ensure that these commitments that governments and companies keep making are actually followed through.
And like back at that point, did you sort of see the law and climate justice as sort of being a real tool to motivate change, or was that something that sort of came through a little bit later on?
Yeah, so I think it definitely came in around that time that I started to explore how international law is used to enforce change, or to enforce commitments, and also to enforce rights for people and nature. So I think it came in parallel, definitely. I think, to be honest, coming from a non-legal background, my background's in international development, that's what I studied and what I'd worked in previously. Um, I felt probably quite overwhelmed by the concept of legal avenues. I thought this is probably too technical for me to understand. But then once I started to get involved and I started to hear about the concept of ecocide, that's when I thought, okay, wow, this could be a real avenue for something really tangible and actionable to happen.
Yeah, like you mentioned a term there, ecocide. It's not one that I can imagine a huge amount of people are particularly familiar with. It's quite a new term. I mean, it's certainly new to me when we first started having our conversations. Um, could you just sort of like describe what ecocide is and what it also isn't, and yeah, what is ecocide law realistically?
Yeah, absolutely. So ecocide law, refers to severe environmental destruction. So ecocide law is the idea that we should criminalize at international, primarily at international level, in the International Criminal Court as the fifth crime. We should criminalize severe environmental destruction in both times of war and times of peace. At international level, has been the initial focus of the reinvigoration of the development of ecocide law, but also many developments are happening at national and regional level as well. So ecocide law is primarily the idea that we should have a crime which prohibits the severe environmental destruction of the environment.
And like, okay, so like, how would you say that ecocide is then sort of defined then in legal terms? So like, does it set a specific threshold, or is it like, do you have to have below X, it's okay, and then you've got to go a bit above that before it becomes officially ecocide?
Yeah, so there was an independent expert panel that was convened by the Stop Ecocide Foundation in June 2021. And after much deliberation, they created the international definition. Ecocide is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So there are a few things to note in this situation. Firstly, it talks about the knowledge. So it has to be an act committed with a reasonable understanding that this act could potentially cause severe environmental destruction. The thing is, we know that environmental destruction is not often the intended effect. So unless it's the environment is being used as a weapon of war, usually environmental destruction is a byproduct of another action. But that doesn't mean that when this action is undertaken, that a person in a position of leadership wouldn't have the knowledge that this could potentially happen. It's also interesting to note that it discusses a substantial likelihood. This doesn't necessarily mean that the environmental destruction actually physically happened or that it was as severe as it could have been, but that there was potential for it to happen, that there was a likelihood it could happen. So, for example, this is relevant when we look to a number of things which are reckless actions that were taken.
So it's more kind of in regards to the intent, almost more than effectively what actually came out of it.
Yeah, so the definition that's been laid out by the independent expert panel has what's called an endangerment rationale. And this means that it's what's criminalized is not actually the result, but is the action. And I think this is important when it comes to environmental damage because of what we previously discussed about how actions are committed not necessarily to cause environmental destruction, but because another action was taken and environmental damage is a byproduct.
Would you say that it's kind of in that way similar to environmental regulation that we currently have and civil liability, or is it kind of operating entirely differently to that?
So I would say that one of the main reasons that we advocate for ecocide law to be included at the International Criminal Court and at national and regional level is because what we currently have is very fragmented. So yes, there are environmental regulations that we currently have, but they don't predominantly focus on criminal individual responsibility. So this is why we think it's really important for it to be included in criminal law, international criminal law specifically. But the other reason for this is that we can see that what currently exists is not serving us effectively. There are too many gaps. There are also too many ways in which fines, etc., can be incorporated into into the balancing sheets. An organization may know that they're going to face a fine when they commit an action which could cause environmental destruction. But if their profit exceeds the loss that they would occur by not doing this act, then it's much easier for them to just pay the fine than it is for them not to do the action. So we hope that instead of what we have with existing environmental regulations, we would move from the polluter pays to the polluter does not pollute.
Yeah, you sort of touched on in that like organizations and stuff would be the targets, or like, would be a target of this law. Like, if hypothetically the ecocide law was currently implemented now, who would be sort of actually at risk of prosecution? Is it government level? Is it individual? Is it corporation level?
Yeah, so it would be individuals, as you discussed, and because it would be alongside the other Rome Statute crimes, it would be people in positions of leadership. So this is could be a head of state, it could be a minister, it could be a CEO of a transnational corporation. But ultimately, of course, this is going to decide on what it is that states negotiate to put into law. So, and then ultimately the decision comes down to the court as to whether or not the person is charged. But this could be an individual at many different levels.
So why would you say that all of a sudden now in the last sort of, I suppose, since 2021, when the initial proposition was put through for ecocide, would you say that it's suddenly gaining momentum rather than 20 or 30 years ago when we first sort of began to understand the issues of the climate crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the movement has been reinvigorated, is what I would say, because ecocide law is gaining new momentum, but it's not a new concept. The concept actually dates back to 1970, when the American botanist Arthur Goulston used the term ecocide to describe what the US had done in the Vietnam War using a chemical defoliant to destroy the forest in Vietnam. So that since then, there were a number of attempts to include ecocide into international law. However, Polly Higgins was a Scottish barrister who, when she asked herself the question of what needs to be done to save the planet, what needs to be done to improve the situation with the climate crisis, she thought to herself, as a barrister, what the earth needs is a good lawyer. But then when she got down to thinking about it, she realized, what are the tools that I would actually need to be a good lawyer for the environment? And she felt they didn't exist. And that's when she came across the term ecocide law, and she started to reinvigorate this movement. Polly sadly passed away in 2019, but since then, the campaign has just absolutely skyrocketed, and momentum to develop ecocide law has happened across the board. And I think this is likely because of a few different factors, partly growing awareness of the issues that we're facing. Also, I think with the political climate being one where people, I think, are able to see what's going on around the world more than ever with social media, etc. And I think there is also, we're in a time where politically, it's not really possible for a government to stand up and say, we think environmental destruction is a good thing. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that each government around the world is going to necessarily agree with implementing ecocide law. But what it does mean is that in this political climate, it's quite hard to stand up and say this is something that we strongly disagree with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just just thought of something. I want to sort of just delve back briefly. When you talk about ecocide and like ecocide law, often when I've been looking, certainly it's often been described of as in terms of the international criminal courts, etc., etc. Does it just apply to the international courts, or does it apply, like, if it does pass into law, it would apply at domestic level as well?
So the International Criminal Court has something that's called the principle of complementarity. And what this means is that the International Criminal Court only intervenes when a domestic jurisdiction is either unable or unwilling to intervene. So what this means in reality is that if ecocide law became part of the Rome Statute, if ecocide became the fifth crime of the Rome Statutes, then overnight, almost, states would have to consider what this looks like in their national jurisdictions. Now, in reality, this is already happening in many different ways. There are governments all around the world considering ecocide law in their national jurisdictions already. And the formal proposal at the ICC caused this to happen already, with states considering how they feel about implementing ecocide law, both nationally and internationally. So, yeah, because of the principle of complementarity, it means that whilst it would be implemented at the top level, this has significant implications further down in national and regional jurisdictions.
How would you say the proposed amendment to the Rome Statute of the ICC is actually going to work procedurally, and also what exactly is the Rome Statute and what its implications are?
So the Rome Statute is the foundational treaty that established the International Criminal Court, which was adopted in 1998, and it came into force in 2002. And so this created the court, which was designed to investigate and prosecute individual responsibility in the most serious crimes internationally. It's looking at the leadership level, so it's not the everyday person. And it looks currently at 4 different crimes. So that's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. So in terms of procedurally how this would look, we would hope that ecocide would become the 5th crime alongside these crimes. That would also be prosecuted in terms of looking at the highest level, the most serious international crimes. So it would be the most serious forms of environmental destruction. We're not looking at, someone who uses fertilizer in their back garden. We would be looking at something incredibly serious and destructive that has severe, widespread or long-term damage.
So you mentioned there briefly that there's a bunch of countries that sort of been quite forthright in and considering ecocide law. What sort of countries are those, and have we had sort of any key diplomatic breakthroughs in recent years towards the adoption of ecocide?
So I think arguably the most important diplomatic development was the proposal at the International Criminal Courts for ecocide to become the 5th crime. So Vanuatu, co-sponsored by Fiji and Samoa and later supported by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, put forward a proposal at the Working Group of Amendments to the ICC for ecocide to become the 5th international crime. So this is, of course, a really exciting diplomatic development. But beyond this, in 2025, in October, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is the world's largest and most diverse environmental network, voted to adopt a motion recognizing the crime of ecocide to protect nature. So this network is made up of government agencies, civil society, and indigenous peoples. So this is the first time that governments have voted on anything related to ecocide law formally. So this was a massive step forward for us. Also, crimes comparable to ecocide was included in the European Crime Directive. And then beyond this, there have been many different national proposals. So Belgium was the first EU country to include ecocide in their law. And there are proposals on the table from everywhere from Peru to Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in sort of just hear a little bit about the Scotland proposition, because they're the first country in the UK to make any sort of proposal towards ecocide. So how significant is it that Scotland has just taken that step without even with their own government, rather than going through the UK government overall?
So, of course, this is a massive development and it's really exciting. We are watching attentively as the bill now progresses to the second stage, which is amendments. It's really significant, firstly, because the bill achieved widespread cross-party support. It had really good numbers in the first vote. And this is important because it shows that ecocide is something that exists beyond political divisions.
And do you think, obviously, the fact that Scotland has made this move by itself almost, do you think that this could put a lot of pressure on the Welsh governments, the English government, Northern Ireland, to follow in their footsteps and introduce some level of UK-wide legislation in the same mould to criminalise ecocide?
Definitely. There is a pretty well-established precedent of Scotland developing legislation and it then being taken up by the wider UK government. So, for example, Scotland was the first government to declare a climate emergency, which was then also declared by the UK government. And some of our most key mental health legislation was actually first developed in Scotland and was then passed on to the UK government. So definitely it could be the case. We are not expecting the UK to adopt ecocide law overnight after Scotland does, but we would definitely be excited about any developments in that area.
And do you think this sort of as well could set a precedent sort of worldwide, where more sort of subnational advances in this vein could almost form a bit of a strategic pathway for getting ecocide to be adopted more widely worldwide?
Definitely. We think that subnational, local governments and regional governments adopting ecocide laws across the board is completely a positive thing. I mean, I'm actually currently at a conference for local and regional governments, and this is something that I strongly believe holds a lot of power, because it is local and regional governments who have a most intimate knowledge of what the consequences of environmental destruction look like on communities. They're the ones who have to respond with service provision when severe environmental destruction does happen. They're the ones who bear that responsibility. And so whilst they might not be the ones in charge of national legislation, they see what happens firsthand when things go wrong. So calls from legislation and also endorsements from cities, local governments, councils, subnational governments. This is all a really positive advancement. And we're seeing this in different areas, from councils in Sardinia are looking at including ecocide law in their penal code, to Camden in London already formally endorsed ecocide law.
That's really positive, actually, to see that sort of that move, that real sort of generic move towards this law. On the flip side of that, however, what are the sort of the political obstacles that are sort of coming through as in the adoption of ecocide law at international level and also subnational level, that's holding it back almost?
I would say that I think in terms of any kind of policy development at the moment, the geopolitical context is, of course, defining progress that can be made. So particularly at the International Criminal Court, the sanctions on the court, they have an impact on the court's jurisdiction and their court's ability to function in general. So, of course, this is an obstacle. But I would say that more broadly speaking, we have been fortunate in that we actually haven't faced too much vocal opposition from any governments as of yet. We, of course, are sure that this will come further down the line, and we understand that this is something that we're prepared for. But as of now, we fortunately feel that the main constraints are, in terms of capacity, of course, each government has a limited capacity in terms of what it is they can focus on. And also, of course, awareness. There's not necessarily the widespread awareness of ecocide law, although this is definitely rapidly developing and has absolutely supported the current progress that we've seen. But I think probably the main constraint, particularly at the International Criminal Court level, would be the day-to-day functions of the court being limited by the sanctions that have been placed on the court.
It's a bit of a sort of a strange question, but I was sort of wondering, obviously that there's a lot of talk about ecocide, and I think that it's really powerful, but is there a risk that if it does come into force and it does become a statement in international law, that it becomes almost seen as symbolic, like something that could be dodged around? Like, how is it going to make sure that it really does regulate and it doesn't sort of get circumnavigated like we've seen with a lot of other climate legislation over the last 20 odd years?
Well, I think what's interesting there is that we describe it sort of as a risk of it becoming symbolic. Now, of course, we hope that ecocide law, if it was to come into force, would be enforced. And this, of course, is the main function of the court. But for me, I think I see the two things in parallel. We can't overlook the significance of having ecocide law at the highest level of international law. Imagine a world where the natural world is put on the same level as genocide, as crimes against humanity, as crimes of aggression. The environment is often an afterthought. And so I think putting it at that level and having that symbol is also a really powerful thing that can't be overlooked. Now, of course, we hope that because it would be international criminal law, that it would be harder to circumvent than existing environmental regulations, as I previously discussed. But I also think that seeing it as also being symbolic is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you look at something like genocide, genocide is a globally understood term. It's a moral line that we understand as an international community must not be crossed. It's a household term, everyone knows it. And so having ecocide alongside this, we see as a positive thing.
No, absolutely, and I think the comparison with genocide, and even just the terminology, even just the lexicon being ecocide, I think really is quite powerful because it connects that kind of idea that it really is on the same level. Like, no one will say that genocide is acceptable, therefore why should ecocide be acceptable either?
The way that we hope that this would trickle down into decision making at every level, because once there is actual risk of being put in prison over environmental destruction, that's a much more significant a burden to carry than a fine. And so I think not only do we hope that this would become part of major leadership decisions, but we hope that through time this will become ingrained in culture, that we understand the natural world to be something to be respected and to be understood as being at the same level as committing genocide, because ultimately we know that it's not just the environment that suffers when we commit severe environmental destruction. Human rights and environmental rights are intrinsically linked. They cannot be separated. And so the communities who experience severe environmental destruction would be able to tell you that if this becomes symbolic in terms of it becomes culturally understood to be a morally prohibited line that we don't cross, this is only a positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of on the topic of sort of the prison or the fine, etc., what would a successful ecocide prosecution sort of look like in practice? How would they be brought to task, etc., etc.?
Well, I think it would follow the same procedures as the current Rome Statute crimes would. But I think this is, of course, dependent on what it is that states negotiate in terms of where it is that the line is, what is it that constitutes ecocide. This is yet to be determined. Of course, we have the we have the independent expert panel definition, which forms a strong basis for negotiations, but we don't yet know what states will negotiate. And so I think this is kind of to play for, to be honest.
I mean, just if we could just sort of take a little segue across, what I sort of came across quite a lot when I was looking into this was the ICJ advisory opinion. Could you sort of just give a brief explanation as to what that is and why does it sort of matter in the broader legal ecosystem?
Yeah, so the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on climate change. Now, this advisory opinion was brought forward by Vanuatu, the same government that's proposed ecocide law, after the Pacific Island students fighting climate change, who were a group of law students from the Pacific, brought the idea to them and said, what would it look like if the world's highest court told states what their legal responsibilities are? So this it is incredibly important for many reasons, but particularly because it's the first time that the world's highest court has declared the responsibilities, has made it absolutely clear to states what it is they must do. It also outlined that human rights and environmental rights and climate change are completely linked. So also customary law as well. It made it clear that in regards to the environment, both human rights and customary law are relevant. All states are under due diligence to do absolutely everything they can in regards to climate change. And basically, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion makes it clear that countries have a responsibility to act beyond just the Paris Agreement. They have a responsibility to uphold human rights law and customary law in regards to the environment. And this is a massive win for all countries, but particularly for small island developing states, who were the ones who brought it to the table and for whom this is the most pressing threat to their peace and security. And internationally, of course, we see that this is also one of the most rapidly evolving and pressing threats to international peace and security.
Even though it's like an advisory opinion, how does it like directly influence state behavior? Like they don't technically, as far as I understand it, suffer any direct repercussions of going against this advisory, but it still has quite a large sway over decision making.
The advisory opinion gives a very, very clear and explicit indication of how it is that the court would act in regards to any dispute on climate obligations. So what this means in practice is that the court has been incredibly clear and has indicated how serious the problem of climate change is and how seriously states must take it, and that it will act. It will act on what it has advised if any country brings a dispute against another country in regards to how they have upheld their responsibilities regarding climate change. It's also, in terms of climate financing, become something that countries and local governments can use to leverage financing for climate. And this is something that I've seen kind of happening, which is a really positive trend in terms of the fact that the court explicitly states governments must do all that they can to prohibit the climate crisis from worsening or from progressing.
And then, yeah, I presume that what that does is then really strengthens the arguments for ecocide criminalization on top.
Completely. I mean, the court has made it very clear that climate obligations are not only moral and political, but they're also legal. And so, of course, that builds a really strong argument for ecocide law. They were both proposed by Vanuatu. So I think this is really significant in terms of we can see the small island states taking leadership on this. And I mean, there's, of course, the fact that the International Court of Justice advisory opinion gives us a clear indication of the horizontal responsibility between states, and ecocide law complements that with the vertical responsibilities that occur under international criminal law. And I think what's also interesting, just kind of segueing a little bit here, is that Vanuatu have described ecocide as the first international crime for the global south. Now, of course, there have been many historical criticisms of the International Court that there's been an asymmetrical application of international law. But I think most of us understand that when it comes to severe environmental destruction, the majority of this is happening in the global south. The majority of this is affecting communities who are already marginalized economically and socially under the existing global order. And predominantly, a lot of the time, this is happening for the economic benefit of actors in the global north. So, what this means is that ecocide, for me, we were talking about symbolic previously, and I think beyond what can be enforced, beyond the symbolism, we're seeing a massive decline in the trust in international law. Understandably so. There have been a number of violations of international law that have been seen by the whole world and that have been massively objected to. But I think including ecocide in the Rome Statute shows the world that international law can adapt. It can evolve to address the most pressing threats to international peace and security. And being what Vanuatu have described as the first climber of the global south, has the potential to even redress the historical power imbalances that have previously been criticized in international criminal law.
Yeah, it seems like, especially in regards to ecocide, but also more generally, that the small island states, etc., have been having a real big say and like really punching above their weight almost in terms of population or government size into actually making the pretty much the global north listen to what they're saying about climate change and about ecocide. And yeah, I think that's really interesting.
It's fantastic, and I have to especially give a shout out to the government of Vanuatu because having worked with them at their mission in New York, I see how fantastic their team are there, how seriously they take these issues, and how much they care and how passionate they are about ensuring that climate change is taken seriously at the UN and in other international fora.
Another sort of thing that I've sort of seen when I've been looking around is the idea of legal personhood and how that sort of relates to ecocide. Because I mean, first time you think everyone sort of would have heard of legal personhood was back in 2017 with the Wangui River in New Zealand, where that was given a legal status as an actor, which could sue other people for performing acts against it. Does this sort of, and we're now seeing it with the River in the UK as well, and is that sort of related to ecocide? Like, would ecocide almost be a similar, or is it quite a different way of dealing with crimes against the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two are very different legal avenues to take, but that doesn't mean that they're not complementary. So, ecocide law, I would say, of course, is about individual criminal responsibility. It's about ensuring that the decisions that we take, there are consequences for environmental destruction. I mean, we don't have a crime of murder because we like to punish people for murdering. We have a crime of murder because we want to stop people from being killed. It's the same thing with ecocide law. Whereas rights for nature is a slightly different approach. It plays on the existing paradigms of rights. And it's, we can see it in constitutional law. So, for example, buen vivir, which is a concept that evolved from indigenous legal concepts and has now been included in the Constitution of Ecuador and Bolivia. So we can see legal rights for nature are growing, and I think that anything that gets to the heart of how the consideration of nature has to be taken very seriously, and the consideration of the consequences when we don't treat the natural world as we would treat people. This is something that I think we see as complementary to the development of ecocide law.
So they can sort of almost see them as not being mutually exclusive. Like, what you can have one, but you can also have the other, and effectively they strengthen one another almost.
Yeah, absolutely. The two mutually reinforce each other.
Looking forward a little bit now, over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 odd years, what do you think are going to be the significant developments that people listening should watch out for? Like, any significant moments you could sort of see coming either in the near future or more distantly in regards to the implementation of ecocide law?
Well, I think firstly, in the very recent weeks to come, keep an eye out for the decision that's made regarding the Scotland bill. This is going to be, less than maybe I think around a month until the decision is made on this. That's really exciting for UK listeners. But beyond this, I think we're going to continue to see developments at national level. We hope that within the next few years, we'll see ecocide included in the Rome Statute. Of course, this requires many complex intergovernmental negotiations, which we look forward to watching play out. But we hope that this conversation will continue to spark an understanding of the severity of environmental destruction and the consequences that must occur if people don't take this seriously. Also, I mean, alongside this, I think legal avenues regarding climate justice are being utilised more. And we see this in the UK even. For example, there are the Welsh Water is now facing a lawsuit for the pollution that's occurred due to sewage discharges and from agricultural pollution. So even in the UK, we're seeing that legal avenues are being used more in order to protect our planet. And I think that this is something we're going to continue to see. Of course, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion has shown us how effective legal avenues can be in clearly outlining the moral and the legal responsibilities that go beyond the moral and political level in regards to climate change.
Yeah, and what would you say that sort of would give you hope going forwards, and also at the same time, though, what are the sort of things that concern you that could sort of start potentially undermine the strength of ecocide legislation going forwards?
Well, I would say in regards to concerns, of course, we understand that political context matters. That it's often more important to wait for the right time to do something instead of rushing something through. And I understand this is, of course, a criticism of the UN that things take a while. But I think, in my experience, it's more important that you have something that's actually effective and that you wait until the right moment, that you can effectively achieve a consensus and you can effectively implement something that is going to have significant impact. Then you rush something through at the wrong time and political context gets in the way. So I think this is a concern, but in terms of what gives me hope, one of the main things that gives me hope is that more people are paying attention to international law generally than I think in recent years previously. Now, a lot of this might be negative attention, it's true, but I think this provides us with an opportunity. People are watching, people are caring about what's happening in international law and in the UN much more than when I started working in this field 6 years ago. So I would say it gives me hope that people care about what's happening with international law. And I believe that ecocide could be something that really shows people how it is international law can work for good and it can address their concerns. So I think overall, I would say I am optimistic.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear that there's a real sense of optimism. That's what I got when I was sort of looking through all the literature around this. There's a real sense of optimism and sort of global cooperation, like in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of different things. Everyone's sort of gone, yes, this is something we want and we would like to go forward with.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting with ecocide law is that it speaks to different regions differently. So, for example, in Europe, a lot of countries and corporations are interested in ecocide law because of the stability it provides, financial safety and personal safety. It provides that kind of stability. In Latin America, there's a lot of focus on rights for nature, as we previously discussed. So this, and I think resource extraction as well, of course, and that spans across to Africa, where also the human rights synergies have been a focal point. And then, of course, in the Pacific, where preservation of statehood, sea level rise, the impending risk to their existence, this is something that, of course, promotes their interest in ecocide law. So around the world, we're seeing how it is that different communities and different people relate to the concept differently and why it is that it gives them hope. So I would say I'm optimistic also because of how it is that despite different contexts, despite the fact that, of course, each individual country and region has to consider how it is they see ecocide being implemented in their jurisdiction, there are commonalities. There are things that each different region see as a force for good, and I think ecocide law is becoming one of those things.
Yeah, that's an incredibly positive thing to hear. And what would you say, like, I'm no climate lawyer, but what would you say that anyone sort of like me who isn't a climate lawyer, doesn't have like a position high up in who's in decision making place for this, what can we do that would like accelerate the shift and sort of lend weight to ecocide being adopted sooner and almost more vigorously and more enforced?
Well, I myself am not a climate lawyer. I don't have a legal background. So I think it's important to start by saying that you don't need a legal background to be interested in this or to be impactful in this area. But I would say having conversations about ecocide law is really important because it is not a broadly understood term, but people are starting to be aware of it. I see posts on social media that are saying things, people are using signs in protest that say ecocide is genocide, things like this. So the movement is happening, and I would say there are so many different opportunities to get on board. If you go to our website, stopecocide.earth, or our social media pages, these all have many different indications as to how you can get involved. But I would predominantly say that following the conversation, being aware of the developments that are happening and talking about them, discussing them with people, understanding how it is that it relates to issues that you perhaps are facing in your local area, and using the concept in this term, in this context is really important. So I would say this is one of the main things that people can do.
Oh, thank you very much, Lauren. That's been a absolutely fascinating sort of delve into a topic that I don't think a lot of people will have much experience in, but I think what you've done is explained it incredibly well and in a way that I think, oh, everyone listening will now be saying, yes, ecocide. I think that's something you want to get on board with and prevent that happening.